pivot to our next topic, which is it's been a pretty hot button topic, at least within the Here and Now Project board. We've been having a lot of conversations around this idea of intersectionality, because when it comes to the Here and Now Project, what we've really built our fellowship on is kind of this spiritual idea that we're looking for the common threads between ourselves and others. You know, I myself used to only see differences before I got connected with folks like Todd Stobelfelt and Ian Mackay, and they helped me see that, you know, if I can find the similarities in our situations, we'd be that much stronger. And you guys got a little glimpse of that yesterday with the different breakout meetings, just getting screen to screen with people that may have different level of injury or diagnosis, all those different, you know, kind of a spectrum of disabilities. Well, you know, with my advocacy and travels, I've gotten to be exposed to kind of even a wider spectrum of the disability community, but also as it comes to race, gender, sexual preference, all of those different aspects of the human experience. And, you know, especially when it comes to race these days, it's, you know, it's been a hot button topic, but, you know, the way that I've been coming to think of it in my slow education myself is just, you know, as someone that woke up in the disability community one day, I suddenly have this view, kind of like Andrea Dalzell was talking about yesterday, that suddenly I'm a part of the largest minority that is out there. But there are, you know, when we think of like the ADA and accessibility, there are still physical barriers that are in place, you know, whether it's a lack of curb cuts or, you know, air travel being held back. You know, there's a lot of those kind of systemic barriers that exist for some of our members who are of color or, you know, LGBTQ, and all of those different aspects of the human experience, which is why we're really excited to have two tremendous activists and advocates with us today. And that is in Luticha Doucette, who is joining us from New York State and has been a longtime activist in the intersectionality space, as well as Dorian Taylor, a quad rugby player and recent ADA management specialist for the King County area. And I just want to introduce both of them to allow, you know, them to tell the story of what intersectionality means to them. And so if we can kick it to Luticha, if you'd like to introduce yourself and just, yeah, give us an overview of the work that you do.
Hey all, well, thank you for having me here today and to kind of sit and talk with y'all. So I'm pretty stoked. I am in Rochester, New York. I've lived here for well over 20 some odd years. And I live with my two cats, Callie and Luna, who are wonderfully, peacefully sleeping in the background. And so I am an incomplete quadriplegic. I also have a brain injury, and I have some chronic illnesses as well that I've just acquired throughout the years. I used to work for the city of Rochester as an innovation specialist, a researcher, ADA coordinator, equity coordinator, and I was the only visibly disabled Black queer person when we were leading our equity initiative with the National League of Cities. And thanks, my earrings come from my friend, Black-owned business, Shop Bobby Rose, if you want to pick up a pair. So, you know, I'm a lover of fashion, all sorts of things. And, you know, got to be disabled and cute. I am also proud member of the LGBTQ community. I'm queer and non-binary, and really understanding what that means, you know, as I've gotten, you know, older and really coming into my own. For me, intersectionality is not about the identities that I hold, because I don't think identities are the issue. I also don't think I'm kind of different. I like looking at differences. I was a scientist in a previous life, and looking at differences is what made science rich and whatnot, and what makes us robust. I don't think differences are bad things. Similarities are also good. So it's a both and for me. But for intersectionality, it for me is really about the systems of power. So, how are we complicit in systems of power? How do we have systems of power impact those of us with different identities? So, the isms that we like to talk about, ableism, racism, anti-LGBTQ. I don't really call it homophobia either because it's not about the fear, it's about power and control. Thinking about all these systems and how they're impacting us, how we can be complicit, right? So, like right now, I'm speaking English. That is a system of power. And access to different things comes if you are an English speaker, right? And if you don't have English as your native language or you don't know how to speak it fluently, things can be, very, very difficult for you in this country. So that's kind of where I approach my business. So, teaching people how to think about systems of power, how we are complicit in those systems of power, and how we can subvert them. So, really thinking through the principles of disability justice and saying, like, what does that mean for cross movement solidarity? What does that mean for, recognizing wholeness of individuals? How does this apply not just to the work that you do, but that equity is everywhere, whether you like it or not, right? And so it's about our personal selves as well as what we bring to the table at our jobs. And that's why I started my business, Catalyst Consulting, because, really thinking about what is the kind of work that I want to be doing, and also what are my needs as a disabled person. I don't fit into a 9 to 5 structure. I definitely did not fit in a government structure. And so, how do I lead the life that I want to be leading? And what kind of legacy do I want to give and teach people? And I think that's a huge part of my advocacy and thinking intersectionality as well. So I hope I answered your question.
No, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's it's in looking at the different layers of all of our experiences and how we can separate those out, all of those experiences, and remove as many barriers as possible to others. Dorian, I don't know if you're able to unmute, but if you'd like to talk a little bit about the work you've been doing as well.
Yeah, I am. I will apologize for my slow speaking. I've got a wicked migraine this afternoon, so please bear with me. Yeah, my name is Dorian, and I have yeah, I've been involved in activist spaces for the last 20 years. I am an incomplete. I have an incomplete. I'm an incomplete parent. Excuse me. Whew. Please bear with me, y'all. It's been kicking all morning. Um, I'm an incomplete paraplegic, and I also have multiple disabilities. I have chronic illnesses, and I'm autistic, and I have been in activist spaces pretty much the entirety of my adult life. Um, and I'm originally from the South, and I like to say that and mention that I'm first generation out of Jim Crow on both sides of my family, because I think it's really easy for us to forget that that was in a recent past. We like to think of it as history, but my father was older than Emmett Till, and so I don't think of it as history. And when things like aren't taught wholly in schools, and our past isn't taught wholly at schools, it's easy to think of things like that as the distant future. But I'm not quite 42 years old, so so this is something that we're still living through. We haven't quite got there yet. You know and because both of my parents high school diplomas said state accredited Negro high schools, so I just like to mention that. And so that's not even that's just like one generation ago for me. And so um, my I've always been involved in intersectionality before I had language to put on it. I'm a recent college graduate, so I a lot of people like to think of this language and think of things like trans identity as something that comes from academia, and I like to combat that. You know, I was have been uh, out most my entirety of my adult life, but I know a lot of this folks in this community don't know me as out because I had to recloset myself for the adaptive sports community. And my the work that I have been involved in pretty much reflects um the um inequities that I've had to deal with in my life. um, I grew up in institutions, and so I started out um, my activism started out with what was originally called Mad Pride, before I was diagnosed as autistic and before um, I became involved in the disability justice movement. And I've because of my experiences. So I'm actually paralyzed from police brutality, and so faced a trial for wrongful conviction, and have been involved in uh, police reform and prison abolition for well before this happened to me, but the last 11 years. And I think that it's a hot button issue that people think just became you know uh, something that people have decided to know. Intersectionality and diversity training aren't actually into anything, don't have anything to do with each other. Intersectionality is just who we are. For example, I am a Black trans disabled person, and I can't separate those experiences from one another. And the things that happen to me and the things that I experience come from all the lenses of who I am. And that's intersectionality. When I experience something, I can't be Black one day and disabled the next. It happens through both through all of these lenses. And it's because of my experience and the intersections that I live through, and that I and the fact that I knew I wasn't alone, that I got involved in the work that I do. And when I first moved to the area, I was homeless, um, and because of the record that I acquired, um, and uh, from just not being able to find a place to live. And I became involved in you know activism towards homelessness and the intersectionalities between disability and homelessness, and started realizing that though that was a high rate of intersection, that a lot of people that lived in the park with me were disabled or on disability and just couldn't afford the the couple of months that you had to save up or have to have rent. If you have records, you don't qualify for a lot of the services that are available. Um, and so when I decided to go to school, I just formulated my career around those things, and I started my own disability and equity consulting business, and uh, uh, began volunteering with Disability Rights Washington, and just really other grassroots organizations. And until now, I am the one of the ADA disability specialists for King County, and I work with the Office of Equity and Social Justice to retroactively apply the ADA to King County's existing policies, which there's a lot there to do. And it's and it's because the county lacks intersection when they when it comes to disability. The county talks a really good game of equity, and most diversity trainings and most equity trainings don't include disability. And it's the sad nature of the fact. And because of the social inequities, disability is structured, based on transgender folks have higher rates of disability. Black folks have higher rates of disability. Indigenous folks have higher rates of disability than any community, and so on and so forth. And so due to the structures of, unfortunately, if you're poor, you're going to have a lack of access to medical care. You're going to have a lack of access to equipment. And so being that our system is structured and the way the ADA is structured, it's often people who who already hold power that are able to advocate in the disability rights community, and therefore voices of people who are often on the margins of society get left out. So that's why I think this is an important conversation to have. And I hope that gives you a little bit of an answer to that question, if of intersectionality being similar to diversity training and thought, because all diversity training really is just training, is just teaching people that there are other people besides themselves. And it's just, that's really all it is.
Right.
So
Right.
I hope that answers the question.
No, and I think that's an important conversation to be kind of the distinction, and that's what, one of the aspects that was kind of illuminating for me is watching movies like Crip Camp, where you get to see that these, it seems like we tend to end up in silos, whether it's disability, whether it's race, whether it's even within the disability community itself. We end up, here's the spinal cord injury community, here's the autistic community, and it's how do we blend that? And I've noticed it within the Here and Now project as well, that unless you have access to a vehicle up until COVID, before we went into a virtual space, but even you've got within the virtual space, if you don't have access to solid internet connections and a good computer or even a phone, it's going to be limiting to people's abilities to get connected with the community themselves. And Luticha, I'd love to just kind of hear your thoughts on what we can do as an organization and individually, to help bring that into a little bit more equilibrium.
The huge questions.
Right.
First, I'd like to thank Dorian for sharing their thoughts, and I'm sorry that you have a migraine. I too have a migraine, so I feel like something going on. So sitting in solidarity with you. I think as organizations, and this is what I tell folk, is one, having to look at yourselves and saying how you have been complicit in the issues. First, how are you going to change yourselves individually? And then what is the commitment and willingness to make change in relationship with other marginalized folk? Like, you bring up Crip Camp, and I didn't really like that movie. I didn't like the imagery when that movie was being presented, having a Black person carrying a white person around, right? and not having the racial context that many Black disabled people don't go to camp and don't have access to camp. Right. So there was that missing layer. And then that the Black Panther Party was treated like as a side chick, not like the main dish, and what Brad Lomax and his advocacy was doing with the Black Panther Party. And so that in and of itself, when we talk about activism, et cetera, do we fully understand the history of Black disabled activism throughout the years? Do we have an understanding of how our organizations are excluding, Black and Brown and other marginalized folk activists in our spaces? What does that look like to not just tokenize and bring them to the table, but if we're talking about the principles of disability justice, that is leadership of the most impacted. So what are the leadership roles that they hold within the organizations? And this is true of any, right? When I look at the majority of those organizations that are dedicated to disabled folk, they are white led with very few Black, Brown folk in leadership positions, if at all, within the organization. And that's a problem, because if we're talking about having a higher rate of disability within these different groups of people, but we're not represented, we're not seen, our activism is actively erased. I think of Anita Cameron, who lives here in the city of Rochester, who is just an amazing individual. She has autism, she is blind, and she's also a lesbian. And she was there crawling up the steps of Capitol Hill, but she gets to live in poverty while other activists get, book deals and podcasts, etc. So how are we contributing to the marginalization of other people, and how do we kind of create partnership? So
nice, thank you. Yeah, it's something that we've been, wrestling with internally with the Here Now Project as well. Just how do we, we want to be more inclusive and not make this just a one-off conversation kind of thing. And I don't know if anyone in the gallery has any questions or would like to expand on that, but yeah.
I think Dorian has their hand raised.
Yep, go for it, Dorian. Unmute.
Yeah, thanks. I just would want to add a little bit on to that, and it kind of reflects back with the lack of history in general. So we lack a lot of history of activism and how all activism starts out radical and then pushes to this more palatable sense. But we also lack of the history of like where things come from. So we know, I'm sure many people here know of ugly laws and eugenics laws, but we don't know how those laws came directly from slavery, and that a lot of people who were enslaved had physical disabilities, and people were just on the streets with nowhere to live and no access to jobs, and so things like rascal laws and things like that started to be put in place, and then they started putting ugly laws in place, and it just transferred to the disability community. And not having that history is huge, because we lack the intersectionality of where our discrimination comes from and where these laws come from in the first place. And so then you flash forward to the history of the disability rights movement, which directly extrapolated everything from the civil rights movement. And they do mention that, but they mention it in very small detail, and they gloss over people as mentioned before, like Brad Lomax and the and the place of the Black Panthers. But also what is glossed over is the fact that the disability rights movement started as an intersectional movement to begin with.
Right.
You know, and and glossing over that history, and that, you know, people with all sorts of disabilities that we now call hidden or invisible, you know, deaf people, that the sit-in wouldn't have even been a sit-in without the Black Panthers. Like, all of these were intersectional, and so you have to ask yourself, what happened to make this movement a movement of primarily wealthy white folks? You know, like, what happened between the 70s and 1990?
Right. Right. Yeah, that was the interesting takeaway that I did notice in there, that it was the Black Panther Party that showed up to that sit-in that kept these people afloat. And it's because, you know, that group had been doing it much longer and a more sustained effort. And that was what they, you know, the disability community was learning from, basically. And then we got a couple of questions. You know, Elaine put in, how can we be a better ally? And then Celine was asking any books, and I know Luticha has an interesting book that I've just bought as well. So if you wouldn't mind speaking to that too.
Sure. So I don't do allyship. I need comrades. Allyship really says that you're not part of the problem and that the issue is separate from you, or I feel like comradeship means that you know that your liberation is tied to the liberation of others, and that you have some skin in the game. So I think the first thing is to kind of work on yourself and understanding, you know, how have you been complicit? Why don't you know the why that Dorian asked? You know, do you know the answer to that question? Can you begin to formulate the answer to that question? Why was Black disabled activism, you know, erased? And why we haven't taken that individual time to answer those questions for ourselves, right? And that just kind of go along with the movement. And that bigger understanding of, you know, I've been taught by a lot of people, some of them have been Black Panthers, and really they always ask, you know, and tell me, you know, when you fully understand racism, then you understand the other isms in this country. And just like Dorian talked about, we have to understand how Black bodies were viewed, you know, in order to enslave somebody else, right? And to justify enslaving somebody else and using them as chattel slavery, right? And how that translates into what we see today. And the way that we're taught history is often siloed. So you have to kind of break that down, right? Ugly laws and the 13th Amendment all happen around a few years from each other, right? And so that's important. We're taught that there are these like separate points in time and not a continuation and part of like the same sort of thing. So how are you understanding, you know, your history? What are you reading? Neoliberalism can lead to kind of like this feeling that things are good, okay, and that, you know, we can program our way to equity, which is not true. So how are we kind of making sure that we have these critical lenses to these movements that are happening? And are you questioning that? Are you questioning yourself? Not to gaslight yourself, but to really say, you know, do I understand what's happening? Or am I jumping on a bandwagon just to jump on the bandwagon? Or because, you know, it invokes some sort of emotional response. And I also think that understanding systems of power, I keep saying that, and how we're complicit, because oftentimes we forget that, you know, we are part of the machine. The system is not this amoeba that kind of rolls around and does what it does. It's full of people making decisions, upholding policy, not being inclusive, not thinking intersectionally, right? And we've all done it, right? I used to work in a government. I've seen how that happens in real time, right? And so that's why I said comradeship is good. And you could totally buy my book, shameless plug. It's available on my website. And I think that it helps kind of build upon what Sins Invalid had started with Skin, Tooth, and Bone, which was really great. And I think it's kind of my next step of like, how do we kind of bring that? This is me, the individual, and how I'm impacted by systems and how I can influence systems. So that's just me. Right.
And I see Dorian is put some of the books and stuff in there. And, you know, it's, this is why I really appreciate this conversation, because with like understanding that it isn't individual silos, it is that, you know, Dr. King's slow moral arc of the universe that bends towards justice. And, you know, in the same way that we are 30 years past the ADA and still don't have the same accessibility rights, like I'm hoping that gives people in other kind of privileged positions a window into the fact that, you know, that the same spectrum exists for the civil rights stuff. Just because there was a Civil Rights Act and Voting Right Act in the 60s doesn't mean that systemic racism has been obliterated just by a handful of laws. And you know, it's my hope that in having these conversations, that this is that continued push in that direction, albeit late to the party. You know, in a lot of respects, so especially for people that have been doing the work, and you know, like I myself, having been, you know, the least marginalized of the marginalized as a white male Judeo-Christian cisgendered person, to wake up outside of it once I got into the disability space, there is a lot to unpack, and but to do so in a way that is, you know, kind of like Charlotte was saying, a loving way, and just a way to have that conversation. And that's why I really appreciate both of you guys coming on to kind of unpack a little bit of that. We still have about 15 minutes still, so and please jump in and correct me if I'm, you know, stating stuff that is not quite, you know, in the right vein as well, because I'm always trying to, like you said, Luticha, learn and grow a little bit. And I think that's what, you know, the great thing about the Here Now Project is that we get to learn and grow from each other. And this is another aspect of that. Did see any other question?
I guess I did see a question on the usage of pronouns, and I'm gonna keep it a buck with y'all. We speak the English language. If we don't know someone's pronouns, then it's really easy to just use their name, and also to just ask that person what their pronouns are, right? Like, that's all that is required. In the same way that, you know, if you're inviting someone over to dinner, you don't want to feed them something that's going to make them sick or whatnot. You would just ask, right? And often people are really good at just telling that, you know what, these are my pronouns. And so we can use them. And if we mess up, we say sorry, and then we keep it moving, right? So I think like a lot of people get so caught up in being perfect, right, and good, rather than just focusing on the human being that's right in front of them, right? And so I think that's just like super important. You know, I don't give my pronouns because for me, the most important pronoun is my name, and often people can't get that right. So perfect that, and then we can keep it moving, right? So I think a lot of that is not to, you know, belittle folk, but to understand that sometimes with the things that we face, the solutions are kind of like right in front of us, and that we do have the tools. When thinking about those who, you know, like us, that are non-binary, transgender, we're human beings, just like anyone else. And so ask, and then use them. But if not always, and that's why I love the English language, as annoying that it is. It's a pretty flexible language. And so the default is use their name.
Right. Well, and that's kind of in the conversations I've had with people trying to organize this space, is there seems to be a bit of the fear of stepping on toes or saying the wrong thing. And I think it comes out of, I think that makes the conversation even more difficult sometimes, because when you are kind of coming to, and when you're late to the party and don't know how to ask those questions, you get a little tripped over your words a little bit. And so it's nice to hear that it really can be that simple as just to ask. So yeah.
Yeah, especially as disabled people, right? We don't want folk to make assumptions about us. And we know how that can be when people have just already decided for us. And then kind of go into that self-anxiety induced mode, right? Rather than just asking what we needed, or, saying, oh, I heard that, if you're deaf, you might need cart captioning and an ASL interpreter, right? So you just make it happen. And then if they need something on top of that, we can ask, well, this is what we provided, is there anything else that you might need, right? So it kind of goes back to just a lot of the stuff around equity is just, how do we be good in relationship to each other? Because I think the biggest thing about ableism, racism, and all this other stuff is that it divorces us from ourselves and from each other. And so we forget how to actually be good relationship with each other. And like, for me, it's just as simple as that.
Right. Well, Dorian, do you have any other things that we still got 10 minutes, so we can keep kind of talking about stuff? If anyone has questions, that we can keep putting those in the chat. But yeah, I just really appreciate this conversation you guys are kind of walking us through. So did we lose Dorian? Oh, there we go. We asked.
Sweet, thank you. I couldn't unmute. Yeah, I as kind of as Letitia mentioned, like, yeah, we're not we're not liabilities as disabled people, and I think when people meet folks, and and there's always this idea that when someone corrects your pronouns, they're being like a jerk or something, and they're just simply asking you to respect them. It's that simple, but like, really, y'all, I'm chill. Like, I don't have that kind of energy to fight with people, and so, like, I think that it's like, it's sometimes it's just like, relax. I think people get all up in their head, and just like, the same way people do when they meet us as physically disabled people, and they get up all in their head and stuff like that. Just chill. Like, chances are that person is, just as chill as you are. You know, um, we're all just having the same human experiences. They're just different ones, but we're all here just trying to, like, live life and be respected. And I think it's why it's important to have these conversations, because in the end we all realize that we're really having, you know you know just we're all just really trying to get through these worlds, and our and sorry, oof, ooh, y'all, this migraine is kicking my tail feathers. um you know so yeah, I tend to refrain from saying things like love and hate, because I think that we lose sight of what those words really mean. um and so I don't think that I really don't think that um a lot of what we deal with comes from hate. I think it just comes from the fact that people don't take the time to listen and learn from other people. And so, like, I think the fact that everyone's like here and doing that says a lot about who you are, right? So I think that's a really important thing to take away.
Right.
I
Well,
really
now,
appreciate you, Dorian, just because like I'm feeling you on this migraine thing. Um, and that also true, like love and hate don't enter into my equation. My liberation isn't based off of whether I love or hate. It's for the good and benefit of everybody, including those who might have been harmful to me or other people. I don't think that they should be excluded, right? Because they're part of the same ish that caused them to do the things that they do. Um, and so really it's about if I want universal health care, that's for everybody. If I want student loans forgiven, it's for everybody. All of that. So it's important, I think, because when we use words like love or hate, those can be very arbitrary terms. And it can be used as a way to exclude certain people. Right. You know, I ain't got time. I've got 99 problems. I can't expend that amount of energy to hate other people. Like, I'm just like, you do you. I'm gonna be over here being sparkly and doing what I do. And so like it's just gotta be, I wish people would have more chill. Like it's not, some of it's just not that deep. Um, you know, but if you're dealing with traumatized people, right, understand that sometimes you might have to use kid gloves with certain groups of individuals or certain individuals, right? You might have to give a little bit more kind, caring, and grace to certain individuals. Sometimes it can't be you that is the messenger. I just want the message to be out. It don't gotta be me, right? Every single time. So really thinking about how we move, why we're moving and doing the things that we do is so important. And I'm just really appreciative, Dorian, for you just even being here with me in these migraine streets, um, giving this presentation today.
my goodness. Yeah. No, I just really appreciate you guys' willingness to come on and have that conversation, because I think you're right that it is, you know, the love and hate spectrum is the ends of the poles, and I think at least for my situation, it was a lack of understanding or a lack of frame of reference, and the more education and exposure we get to all of these different spectrums and all of these different experiences, I hope that we'll be able to take away, you know, that you know, the differences make our whole world richer, but then the more aware we are of how we move through the world with them, that we'll be able to remove some of the barriers that we want removed from ourselves, whether it's, you know, access to any of the same stuff that we struggle with a disability, you know.
Yeah, I think like it's so important. And, you know, just like Dorian talked about earlier, you know, I'm also first generation out of Jim Crow. And my aunt talks all the time about living in Jim Crow New Orleans and being shot at while she was on the school bus. Um, and when I went in 2018, just for a visit, you know, having my uncle drive me to the exact same spot because you have to go through that spot to visit the neighborhood, right? And be like, yeah, she was shot at from that house over there. Those people who shot at her school bus are still there, right? Still living in the community, still kind of existing. Their kids are still around. We talk about some of our, you know, sitting senators like Mitch MCConnell, right? Well, why is he? He's from the South, right? That's how he was raised. So we can't be, sometimes I think people get really frustrated with their activism instead of seeing, you know, the person for how they are, right? And just being like, is this person going to change? No. This is how they were, this is how they were socialized. Was Mitch MCConnell born acting like that? No, he went through a dehumanization process, right? That was supported by his parents, their friends, their family, right? Their community. That's how we get to where we are. And that is why it's so hard to kind of make these changes, because it's not about, oh, this person over here is like this, because that's how we're taught racism is. Instead of the soup that we're kind of swimming in. And then you want to point to this other person who you say, oh, that person's drowning, it ain't me, but you're up to here, right? In the soup, not recognizing that you are actually drowning. So a lot of this is do we actually understand that living history, right? That the history of advocacy, especially in white people, isn't one about sustainability. There is no sustained action, right? It's like we freed the slaves, but why were you doing that in the first place? Was it about the humanity of the people who were enslaved, or was there some sort of other reason, right? Because if we don't have that long-term kind of thinking, right, it's just we're going to do these small actions and then never see any real change. Change can actually happen tomorrow if we actually wanted it to. And so we have to get to the why we don't want it to. And what are the barriers to making the kind of changes that we know that are needed? COVID has shown it. You need universal health care. So why aren't we protesting and making sure that, we all get what it is that we needed? Dorian is in a county that has neglected the Americans with Disabilities Act, even though as an obligation of being a government entity, they have to abide by the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's just, I worked for a city that did not have an ADA transition plan. I've just now been hired and they're like, for $108,000 of which you'll only get $20,000 of this contract, will you write an ADA transition plan? The answer is no. I'll show you how messed up that is. And then you'll have to come back and pay me at a higher price in order to do it, right? So no ADA coordinator, even though you're obligated to, and it's mandatory by law. Okay, right? So things like that, right? And then the people just get away with it, right? There is no oversight and accountability. And when we don't have a kind of solidarity from our non-disabled folk, right, to see that these things are actually a problem, then that also is kind of stagnant. I think it's egregious that it's always those who are most impacted who have to raise their voices and do the bulk of the work while everyone kind of sits back and is just like, maybe we'll get to that. Maybe we'll join you, right? But let there be, a cute kitty cat in crisis, and then everyone kind of moves on more. Not that I don't like cats, but right? Have the same compassion and call to action and readiness, right, for your fellow human being. And that's kind of what we're asking for. And at this point, I don't think it's ask, it's more of a demand because we've had time.
Well, I really appreciate Dorian and Luticha for coming on and having this conversation with us. Yeah, I find it in my own, even in just the Here Now Project work that it sometimes you fall into those traps of having different pushes that aren't a sustained kind of ongoing push. And so it's a good reminder that, constant vigilance is the only way to keep, it's the way we keep ourselves physically healthy, and it's also the way that we can help change the world. So yeah, we're going to have all of this stuff, on our YouTube channel as well, and we'll have links to Luticha's book and everything for people that's available. I want to thank you guys so much for your time and your willingness to walk me and everyone else in attendance through this. It's been a really, really important conversation that we've wanted to start and continue going forward.